Our next speaker, I'm very pleased to present, Alex Capron, and he is the Scott Vice Chair in Healthcare, Law, Policy, and Ethics at USC, and he will talk about next-generation ethical considerations in medical research and practice.
I've been thinking for the last hour or two that I'm either in the presence of the most ethical people at USC because they are here all day, or the people who feel they are most in need of ethical instruction, and so they've stayed the longest while all those on the straight and narrow have already left. This morning, Dean Mosqueda of the Keck School of Medicine said that X in the title made her think of the future. I'm a more literal-minded person, and I will be looking at situations where there is or there probably will be change. That is, we have the present or the recent past, and then comes the next. And the characteristics of that movement are what interest me. At what point would we speak of a next generation of ethics rather than simply the application of existing ethical ideas to somewhat new situations? This morning, Jack Knott described ethics at the level of policymakers in society, and Jim Ellis spoke of personal and organizational ethics. In a moment, I will break that down a little further and suggest an additional level between the personal and the organizational, namely occupational ethics. But first, I want to direct our attention to a common feature of all the ethical systems, namely, as some of the other speakers have suggested, they all concern what is right action in any particular circumstance. What should an actor do to others as to their welfare or their interests, be those others individuals with whom they're dealing, groups or generations, the present versus the future, or even the more abstract others as embodied in the environment. What are the ethics of the environment? I want to make clear that when I speak here of an actor, that the relevant actor can be not just individuals, but institutions, such as a business or even society, as sort of a vague, non-described group, but we understand societal ethics. And also, of course, specifically society is embodied in government, the state. Now, sometimes the ethical precepts are so clear and widely held that they are manifested in laws. And then what is the right thing is no longer just the right thing, but the thing that one must do. When that happens, the overlap in those circles of ethics and law that Yanis Yortsas spoke about this morning becomes an identity. The laws embody our ethical commitments. Many people, in their most idealistic or aspirational moments, think of the United States Constitution that way, not the Constitution as it stood in 1787, when it embodied the notion that some people were not people, but rather the way we think it has evolved to today, where there is a commitment to the equality of all people before the law. That's an ethical commitment, and it's embodied in our fundamental legal document. Now, when it comes to personal ethics, however, we often insist that legal rules do not exhaust our ethical obligations. The Golden Rule, or the Boy Scouts motto, do a good turn daily, are example of ethical rules that have no legal equivalent. Indeed, if they were legal obligations, they might lose the very thing that motivates people to follow them, which is the sense of acting in a supererogatory way, one that goes beyond one's enforceable obligations to take on commitments that one chooses to do because one wishes to behave morally. Likewise, as Kirk Hansen suggests, the broadening of business ethics that he believes that artificial intelligence may bring goes beyond, he says, what regulations now are going to require. And so I take it from those comments that he believes that boards and officers of corporations will, using the new artificial intelligence, be in a position to act in a way beyond what they are narrowly obliged by law to act, to go beyond what many people on the last panel were talking about of compliance with the law to something more. I think it's also important to recognize that ethics in the public sphere, both ethics behind collective acts such as equal justice as an ethical principle, and that behind individual acts can take different forms. Ethical systems exist to focus on not just the kinds of things that we think of if we talk about, say, the Golden Rule or something, but on maximizing welfare. I mean, we often think of the obligation that we have to use public resources in the way that promotes the public good to the highest degree. Other ethical systems will focus on rights, and the right action then becomes which system most fully achieves those rights. Now, in the individual realm, which is really where I want to focus, I mentioned before the difference between personal ethics, which rest on a number of grounds, and occupational ethics. And I said to Ted Braun after his talk that I was so glad that he had highlighted for you an example which brings out role-specific ethics. And in his examples, there were some things which to me seemed like a personal situation. Do you honor your promises? That's not role-specific. All of us, we make promises to our spouses and to our friends, as well as to people with whom we're having other interactions. Do we honor them? Are we, in that way, a person who keeps his or her promises? So as, in effect, on site, because of a promise made to the government, he thought his action would have to reflect that. Likewise, he was a guest of the sheikh. And you sort of say, well, in that situation, there are certain norms that govern. The sheikh was doing him favors by allowing the filming. Should he do a favor by lending the car? But then there are also more role-specific duties. As a documentary filmmaker, isn't he supposed to be showing us what is happening, not influencing what is happening? Likewise, as a person who has people who are dependent on him, his cinematographer and film person, doesn't he have obligations to their welfare and so forth? So those are role-specific, and they're separate from personal. It is not to say that the role-specific ones in any way supplant, but they are often supplemental to and more specific depending upon the role. And the classic set of roles are those roles which define the professions. Part of the reason that we have professions is the notion that the lawyer, the doctor, the priest are in a group that sets its own standards, standards of knowledge and practice, but also ethical standards. And we are reminded of this, of course, when people in those groups do not live up to those standards. But the notion that being a profession means you have control over entrance into the profession and policing of who is behaving correctly in the profession. And Vince Cerf this morning reminded us of a canon of the Hippocratic tradition, a precept which, as he said, is not part of the oath, but is reflected in the oath. We know it not in Greek, as we would if it really came from Hippocrates' lips, but in Latin, primum non nocere, above all, do no harm. Now that was, in my view, something which was really much more pragmatic. Doctors who were observant could see their interventions often caused harm. And Hippocrates was really telling his followers, don't intervene very often because you'll probably make the patient worse. And that's something that modern physicians still remember. But underlying that was this self-denying ordinance that the medical profession imposed upon itself to put the interest of the patient ahead of the doctor's interest. And I always say to our medical students, if we didn't have that, you would not have a profession. If your relationship with your physician was your relationship to a used car salesman, where you go onto the lot to buy a nice fuel-efficient family hatchback, and you drive out with a red convertible, that salesman has not done a wrong. That's that salesman's job, and that's the relationship with you. You're supposed to remember another Latin phrase when you deal with him, caveat emptor. But otherwise, that's an arm's length relationship, as your relationship with Facebook is. I mean, we're all upset with Facebook, and they have a public relations scandal on their hands. But they're a business, and we've been fooling ourselves if we think otherwise. They're not our friends calling each other up and talking about things going on in our lives. This is a business operation. How do you think they can mount all that? They take our data and sell it. And this is not the first time it's been in the press. It's just the first time that it's been in the press with this connotation. So there's a difference with the professions. You have to be able to trust that your doctor has your interest and not his or her interests in mind when a recommendation is made, when a decision is made to say you need this treatment or not. This is not the red convertible the doctor is selling you. It's the thing that you actually need. Now, the next generation story really began for medical ethics in the 1960s. And there two forces came together then. Part of the force was a wide range of new developments, technological developments, in behavior control, in transplantation, determination of death, intensive care units, artificial reproductive technologies. And as these things began to occur, there was a question, do regular medical ethics tell us what's the right thing to do? And the other thing that happened was a realization among people, in part because of the application of some of those technologies, patients who found themselves or their family member being treated endlessly at the end of life. And the question, not that doctors were doing this to line their own pockets, because that really wasn't the situation, but that doctors felt that they were kind of trapped in that. And wasn't it the right thing to do? Because the medical principle was life above everything, keep the patient alive. And yet patients said, well, that may not be in my interest. Part of that serving the patient's best interest, which is the history of medicine, was who decides what the best interest is. And the tradition in medicine had been the doctor decides. And so the second thing that happened, at the same time that many other rights movements were happening, consumer rights and so forth, was patients' rights. Shouldn't that be a determination in which the patient ultimately has the say? What is the interest that's being served? And these things came together, these two things, the overthrowing of medical paternalism and the addressing of the new technologies, and they came together to say, we need a new ethics, and that's bioethics. Now, so bioethics is sort of the next generation to medical ethics, and it took on a wider range of things, but it also approached them all in a different way, saying someone other than just doctors. Yes, doctors set the standards for their profession, but their profession is having so many implications, so many other people are involved. The federal government is spending a lot of money on healthcare and on research. Patients' lives are being affected in ways that were never possible before. So what's the goal has to be determined in a different way. It can't just be doctors alone. So what's the next generation now? And I'm just going to address it in the medical area, but it seems to me that's the question we're all asking today. What's causing a next generation? Why aren't the existing ethics everything we need? So 3 issues immediately pop to mind in the medical area. The first is that organizations are made up of professionals, but when they come together as an organization, they aren't just an embodiment of their profession. So doctors working for health plans and hospitals, what happens when we turn to them and try to harness their personal interests by giving them incentives as a means of promoting our collective interests? For example, giving financial incentives for cost containment. Now, the notion of holding down medical costs is very attractive. If we could make people want to do less, there's no question, it's like all the other discussion of incentives and perverse incentives. You pay doctors for procedures, they're going to do procedures, and if you don't pay them for talking and working with their patient on the cognitive side, they're not going to do that. So we want to say we want to change that. But if we do it through financial incentives, are we appealing to something that we weren't supposed to appeal with? How then do ethics adjust to say, well, we do need some levers, but we still have to have this notion of the patient's interest first? When we look at medical institutions and organizations like hospitals and so forth, we see them behaving like other organizations in the business world, profit and not for profit. The Keck Medical Center is expanding. It's expanding not just because there's a need for more institutions, because largely what it's doing is buying institutions. It's way behind the UCLA Medical Center, by the way, in doing the same thing. UCLA healthcare is all over Los Angeles. Now, why do health centers do that? They do it because market share means a lot. They're dealing with the behemoths of health insurance on the other side that are bargaining with them. How much discount? You say this is a $1,000 procedure, we'll give you $180. No, we want $300. We'll give you $230. I mean, that going back, the bigger you are when you're dealing with the big guys, the better chance you have of getting paid well. So those are organizations just behaving like businesses, but they're supposed to be in the medical area. How do we reconcile that? The second is the relationship to major social issues. Is it a medical issue in response to which physicians should act that our nation has a larger percentage of its population in prisons than any other advanced industrial society? If an infectious agent were robbing us of many of our youth, of their youth and of their vitality, wouldn't physicians be responding to that? A related issue is obviously gun violence. And I won't say more about that except that the state of Florida, where we've just seen this most recent tragedy, has a law in the books that forbids physicians to discuss with their patients whether or not the patients have guns in their home. Any other safety issue, the doctor, pediatrician, or family doctor can talk about, but not guns. So there, too, is the issue of what happens when we have a challenge of that sort to the prevailing ethics. What about climate change, which is endangering our planet, not just in some abstract way, but hurting the health of individuals? A few months ago, my friend Don Berwick, the founder of the Institute for Healthcare Improvement and the former administrator of CMS, the Medicare-Medicaid agency, declared in an opinion piece in JAMA, professional silence in the face of social injustice is wrong. In this, he is leveraging the traditional medical deontology, the placing of the welfare of the patients first, because it amounts to a claim on physicians that is different than the claim one has on Facebook or General Motors or Nationwide Insurance. But Berwick is also implicitly arguing for a collective ethics that goes beyond and perhaps even upends the obligations to the individual. This is an example of the disruption, the call to re-examination and the challenge of thinking hard about the implications of change that I believe the term next generation should raise for all of us, not just in medicine or in law or in pastoral care, the traditional professions, but in all fields of occupations, the callings, and the organizations that are represented here today. Thank you.